This is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center for Recovery and the Radical Recovery Summit. And I'm just so delighted today to be talking with Dr. James Gordon. He has a really interesting history, and I'd like to ask some questions of you about your history and what it is that you do. But big picture, he's just written a book about trauma and called Transformation, and works with large populations, which I find is so interesting. A lot of trauma work happens with individuals or very small groups, and I know you work with small groups as well. But some of the work that you do is covers such a broad range. And after I read your book, I did some of the shaking and dancing and some of the practices that you have in your book with some people, and everybody really loved it. So let's just jump right in. So you're a Harvard trained psychiatrist. You've had years of experience with the complementary medicine and how to bring that in. And it must be so satisfying for you to see the difference. Like, what are you seeing as the difference between when you first started your career and now in terms of people's knowledge and acceptance of that?
Well, when I first became interested in what we then were calling alternative or holistic medicine, which slightly evolved into complementary and integrative medicine. When I first became interested in those approaches, which are outside the conventional medical canon, the conventional medical worldview and practice, most everybody thought I was crazy, which may or may not have been true or may not be true now. But now people are saying everything has been evolving significantly. So, for example, I became interested in acupuncture about 50 years ago. And at that point, acupuncture was regarded as a Chinese delusion, not to put too fine a point on it.
Right.
Then, and why would somebody, with my fancy educational credentials be interested in acupuncture? It's total mystery. Even though at that point, I was reading some of the research that was coming out of China, including most impressively, the research on use of acupuncture with animals, in veterinary medicine. I remember one study on the treatment of laminitis, inflammation of the hooves in oxen, and it showed remarkable gains. And by that time, this is the 1971, 72, some people were saying, well, maybe it's not a delusion of the Chinese, maybe it's a placebo effect because the Chinese believe in acupuncture, it works. And I read this perfectly well done study, and I thought, I don't think oxen have much of a belief system. So it was that kind of world very early on. Meditation, that was just for weirdos, or those Indian yogis who starve themselves, and Americans who you didn't want to pay too much attention to. But obviously, things have come a long way since then, and many of these approaches have been admitted to, first of all, but it's been a struggle. I chaired the Whitehouse Commission on Complementary and Alternative Medicine Policy and chaired the Advisory Council of the NIH's Office of Alternative Medicine. And there were people who were saying, no, we shouldn't even be studying these things scientifically. It's giving them too much credence. Mm-hmm. Which, of course, is an utterly unscientific way of approaching the world. So, but with those struggles, I think that there's much more acceptance of these approaches. I think that, and so, yes, it's enormously gratifying. There is still, right now, a major hurdle, which is at least as important. That is, in most places, these approaches are regarded, whether it's meditation or acupuncture or nutritional therapies or herbalism or guided imagery, these are regarded as, you used the word earlier, complementary, or they're part of programs of integrative medicine, which is a perfectly good word, but those programs have been sort of ghettoized, and they're kind of, in most places, they're off to the side. The next stage, and they're beautiful. Many of those programs are wonderful programs, but they're only available to a relatively small portion of a hospital or clinic population. The next step is to make what we're calling integrative medicine or integrative health, or make that the standard of care. All of these approaches should be used as appropriate. And yes, that cliche about the level playing field applies. What's the evidence for? What's the evidence against? When do we use them? How do we integrate them with conventional medicine? And how do we study them in a scientific way? So, yes, we've come a long way, and I'm gratified. And there still is this next step. And then, even more important than the complete integration is the focus on self-awareness, self-care, and group support, which is really the focus of our work at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine and the focus of my work in the transformation, giving people the tools they need to understand and help themselves, and understanding that that kind of self-care is, as I said 25 years ago in another book, that's the true primary care. And
Right.
once that's where the most profound revolution has yet to happen.
Well, and how that's paid for is a big part of this. I know in Canada you get $500 a year for psychology, and only if you have a benefit plan. So you can go to the doctor as much as you want, a regular MD, but you can't get help easily for mental health issues. And unless you kind of get a diagnosis and you're kind of part of that population, and then you might be able to get some help. But it's not seen as something that's really integrated yet in the way that you're talking about.
That's certainly true. And it's also true that approaches to self-care are not valued, that we're still, even in the mental health professions, we're still to a significant degree limited by a medical model, which is I'm the doctor, I'm the therapist, you're the patient, here's your diagnosis. The most important thing is my treatment of you. Now, that is important. I'm obviously a doctor, a psychiatrist, I do treat people, but I recognize that what's ultimately most important is what people do in all those other hours of their lives when they're not sitting in the office with me. And
Right.
so my primary job is really to teach them and give them the tools they need to understand and help themselves. And I'm there as a guide. Sometimes I think of myself as a midwife to that process of transformation that people can go through.
Hmm. So let's talk about that a little bit. So someone comes to your attention. I know you work with large groups as well. So, like for instance, in Bosnia, how did that work out? That you went there, that you were helping people in that war. What was kind of going on there?
Well, I have been using these approaches, both approaches that include self-care plus other approaches that require a professional. I am a psychiatrist. I work with acupuncture and Chinese medicine, herbalism, nutritional prescribing. I do manipulation the way osteopaths or chiropractors do, even though I'm an MD. So I was doing that in my practice. And then I started the Center for Mind-Body Medicine in 1991 because I recognized that the next revolution had to be bringing self-awareness, self-care, and group support into the center of all healthcare, the training of all health professionals, and the education of our children. That's the next place that we have to go. So that was, I started the center to make that a reality, make that possibility and that hope a reality. And we began to train people here in the United States in these methods of self-awareness, self-care, and teaching them also how to lead small groups. And that was going very well. And people were integrating what we were teaching them into medical schools and hospitals and clinics and community-based organizations. And I got it into my mind, however these things happen, that I wanted to see if this same approach that was working so well with individuals here and in individual practices, if it could be of help in some of the most troubled places on the planet. So I started going to some of those places and presenting myself, sort of showing up, usually knowing one person. In the beginning, I went with a colleague who was a family physician. And we would say, here's what we have to offer. We do some workshops. People would get interested. And I began to see that this work translates very well across cultures. So former child soldiers in Mozambique could get it. They could do the meditation or the shaking and dancing or the guided imagery or the drawings. And so could people who'd had family members killed during apartheid in South Africa. And then it was just after the Dayton Accords had been signed, making the peace in Bosnia, a very uneasy peace, but a peace, that I said, oh, somebody suggested I go to Bosnia. I said, okay, that sounds like a challenge. 4 years of war, 200,000 people killed, terrible ethnic strife. And Susan, my colleague, and I began to work in Bosnia, and we saw that the approach could be applicable, but a lot of patterns had set in, a lot of patterns of trauma, physiological, psychological, behavioral patterns. And even though certainly we could do some good, and people we were beginning to train in Bosnia were wanting to use what they learned, it seemed that the most important thing was to go in the beginning when the trauma was being caused. So we went in, as soon as the war began in Kosovo in 1998, we went there. We showed up during the war. And if you're going to work with, a population of 2 million, you've got to work with groups. You want to figure out, okay, what do I do? How do I bring something that works well with individuals to a whole population? And so over time, during the war and then after the war, we decided that what we will do is train the local people who are serving the whole population. So the psychiatrists, the physicians, the nurses, the very few other mental health professionals who existed, the teachers, the clergy, the leaders of women's groups. Those are the people we would train to use our model. And then we would help them figure out how to use it in whatever setting they were working in, whether it was a community mental health center or a school system or a shelter for women who'd been raped during the war. And that's how we began, and that's how we've continued. So the idea is, it's not that everybody's going to come to me or to people from the United States for their treatment. We're going to share what we have to offer with the people in that community, in that country, and they, in turn, are going to make it available to the whole population. So the program in Kosovo continues 20 years later, and our model is integrated into all the community mental health centers in the country. And that's an example, and that was really our pilot program. We were kind of seeing if this work was useful in other places, but Kosovo, for all kinds of historical reasons and just good fortune, became the pilot program and the model for our work now in probably 15 or 20 other communities, both here in the United States and around the world. And it's the same model everywhere. Train the local leaders who are interested, teach them how to integrate what they've learned into what they're already doing or the new programs they're creating, provide mentorship and supervision for them as they do it, and study and publish the research on what we've done.
Right. Wow. So what are some of the basic things they do? I know you cover it so well in your book, but for listeners who haven't had a chance to read your book yet, so there's breathing, there's meditation, there's shaking and dancing.
You're smiling, so I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Oh, I very much enjoyed your book. Yeah.
The basic idea is to teach the early technique. First of all, what I say in the transformation is that it is possible to move through and beyond trauma, even the most terrible traumas. That I've seen it. I've worked with people for 50 years. I've seen people using the method that I teach in the transformation over the last 30 years, seen them make strides. We've done research on it. There's research on the efficacy of the individual techniques. And there are also, and I present these right from the beginning, inspiring stories of people who have done it, people who are like the people who are reading the book. So the program itself builds on that foundation of, first of all, understanding that trauma of one kind or another is going to come to all of us sooner or later. Second of all, that it is possible to move through and beyond the trauma, and that there's evidence for that. And then I start with teaching some basic techniques to bring us back into physiological and psychological balance. And you mentioned two of them. One is slow, deep breathing, which our viewers and listeners can do right now, just breathing in through the nose and out through the mouth with the belly soft and relaxed. And doing that for 5 or 10 minutes, what happens is we balance out the fight or flight response. And fight or flight is a perfectly natural response. It's life-saving in an acute emergency. But when it continues over weeks, months, years, it becomes debilitating because we're always in that tense, we're poised to fight or to run as if there were a threat to our lives when the threat may be long over. And the threat in any case may not be physical at all, it's an emotional threat. But if we can begin to come into balance, and slow, deep, soft belly breathing is a very easy, non-denominational, non-threatening way to do it. You don't need to pay any money or change your clothes or change your religion, or just breathe slowly and deeply and say the word soft as you breathe in and belly as you breathe out. Let your belly be soft and relaxed. Activates the vagus nerve, which is the antidote to the fight or flight response. Quiets fear and anger in the amygdala, a portion of the emotional brain. Stimulates parts of the frontal cortex that make it easier to think clearly, to be self-aware, to have compassion for other people. Makes it easier when the vagus nerve is stimulated, makes it easier to read other people's facial expressions, to tune into what they're saying. So that's first technique. Second technique is the one that you mentioned also, the shaking and dancing, which often causes little self-consciousness, a little merriment among the people who do it. Basically, you get up, you stand up, if you can stand. If you can't stand, you can do it sitting. If you can stand, you stand up with your knees a little bit bent, and you start shaking from your feet up through your knees and chest and shoulders and head. And what this does is, first of all, it helps to break through the fight or flight response, but it also, perhaps even more importantly, helps to break up the fixed patterns that come from the freeze response. So when we're traumatized, if it's a situation where we can sort of do something, or then we go into fight or flight, we try our best to do something about the situation. If we're completely overwhelmed and the situation is inescapable, an assault, a rape, a child who's being abused, if we stay in a situation like that, for example, an abusive relationship where we're constantly overwhelmed, we feel we can't leave, then we just shut down. And our body may collapse, we may fall to the ground, we may just be tight. Our thinking is kind of hemmed in. We can't connect with other people. We're putting out endorphins to protect ourselves against the pain. Again, this is a life-saving response. Mm-hmm. And a mouse that's caught by a cat, she goes limp in the cat's mouth. And what happens, and I've seen this, I used to live on a farm and had pet cats, the cat often get bored. A mouse is not fighting, it's no fun. So the cat put down the mouse would shake herself off, run to the mouse hole. Now, we humans stay in the freeze response, again, for weeks, months, years. You see this so often when people have been raped, see it when they've been assaulted terribly, see it in a lot of military people. I was just with a group of vets the other day, and this one guy told me that when he was in Iraq, there was a firefight, and there were these two kids who were very badly wounded. He said, I froze. I couldn't even use the first aid that I know so well how to use. I just froze. He said, and I'm still in that state a lot of the time. I'm just shut down. So we got him up shaking and dancing. And for the first time, he said, at least my body is feeling a little looser. And if you could see, instead of being a Marine just like this, he was moving around a little more loosely. So shaking and dancing. Shake for 5, 6, 10 minutes, whatever you want. Pause for a couple of minutes. Just be aware of your body and your breath. And then put on some other music that's inspiring and energizing. It's very freeing for people. And then from there, once people are in more of a state of physiological balance or know how to get into that state, then we can use all the other techniques. We can work with guided imagery, work with biofeedback, using feedback about temperature to educate our brains about how to raise our temperature in our hands and calm ourselves down while we're doing it. We use written exercises for people who can write, genograms. I encourage people to spend time in nature, have exercises with gratitude and forgiveness. We work with food. It's a very important part of a trauma healing program. That, as far as I know, nobody else who's written a book on trauma has written about how important food can be in healing all kinds of trauma and chronic stress. So I have a whole chapter on that. And it's a very powerful intervention that anybody can use. So all of these, I teach people all of these techniques, provide the science, and then kind of give them guidance on how to put them together in programs that make sense to each individual, because after all, we're all different. So one combo may be great for me and another may be good for you. And the idea is not to do X, Y, or Z, but to put together X, Y, and Z and A, B, C, and D in a way that works for you.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing that I appreciated, I listened to your podcast with Rick and Forrest Hansen, and you were talking so passionately about that everybody can heal. And so how do you get someone who really doesn't believe that, who's really frozen? Maybe they've had, their nervous system has been impacted for decades. How do you kind of inspire them to believe that that might be true for them?
Well, I hope that the book does the job of inspiring them, because I'm telling them about people just like them. Right. There are people I know who were so damaged and had their nervous systems and their psychology so disrupted by, for example, repeated childhood rape, incestuous rape, and brutal beatings. And some of these people who are magnificent adults, they have used as the core of their healing, they've used this very same approach, and they've brought in other techniques as well. So here are the examples. Here's the evidence for the effectiveness of the approach. And what I'm saying is, this is an invitation. This is not an order. You don't have to do this. Right. But I'm saying I have seen this possibility in so many people over the years. And if you're interested, do the experiment. Start using some of the techniques. Many of the people who, for example, they'll start and they'll do the soft belly breathing. Mm-hmm. And they'll notice a little change. And that gives them, not only is it beneficial specific change, maybe the shoulders are more relaxed, or their groin seems clearer, or they feel calmer, or their heart rate slows down, but they're also getting the message, I can do something. And people, you have to be patient. If you've been traumatized for, since you were a small child, it's going to take time. It's going to take time and effort. It may be simple, but it's not easy. And I don't pretend that it's easy. These, a lot of challenges are going to come up along the way. I'm fond of quoting Jimmy Cliff, the reggae musician. And he says, opposition will come your way, and it will. Right. But it's possible. And the other thing that I would just say to those people is, check out the people in the book and let them be your inspirations. And also, it's very helpful if you can be on this program with other people, friends or family members, or just somebody else who's interested, or you can join one of our online groups. We have online groups at the Center for Mind-Body Medicine, or go see someone in your area who's been trained and get that group support. Some people don't particularly want group support or need it. Others do, and it's fine. And that's what we're trying to do, is to make this available to everyone. So if and when you're ready, the invitation is open to everybody. And I can assure anybody who's watching us that I have seen people who are just as traumatized as anybody watching this, who have moved through and beyond the trauma. It doesn't mean they're totally unflappable, or something may not remind them of something that happened, but they're living full and fulfilled lives.
Right. So other people, when we've been hurt by people, and then you're talking about getting together with other people or being in group with other people, I find a lot of people are kind of reluctant about that. It's hard to trust. What's your experience with that?
It's a very good point. People have to move at their own pace. The thing is, once you start to come into balance, once your nervous system starts to come into balance, it is easier to connect with other people. I think this is really important. When we've been severely traumatized, parts of our brain that facilitate connection, compassion, and trust are more or less disabled. So it's not, that yes, you're suspicious, but the reason you're suspicious is because of what's happened to you. So you have to begin to rebuild those parts that have been damaged, and then trust becomes easier. But don't force it. Just see when you're inclined to, when you're inclined to take a chance with someone. My suggestion is do it, and don't do it if you're not so inclined. This is not about proving a point. It's about doing something when it feels right for you. So just be compassionate toward yourself is what I would say.
Right. So I work a lot with people around self-compassion, and it's a real sticky point. How do you get people to stop kind of feeling like I have to deserve it? I don't deserve kindness. I don't deserve self-compassion. How do you get them to kind of open up to that?
What I'm thinking now is one of the techniques that I've sometimes used is a laughing meditation. Get people to laugh at themselves. We humans take ourselves far, and I include myself, we take ourselves far too seriously. Get over it, but experience the possibility that you can get over it. Don't get over it because I say so, but look at yourself in a mirror for 3 minutes and laugh and see what happens. Just check it out. So, I want to, and each person's different. So what came to me as you were speaking in that moment was that's one technique. And I've used it for myself. When I'm thinking, oh, I don't deserve this, or I'm so bad, or what about, this is one of the techniques I've used. Sometimes I've just used soft belly breathing. And I feel, oh, it's kind of nice to be in this body. It's not such a miserable thing. I can feel myself and feel okay. Sometimes I may do shaking and dancing. Sometimes I go into nature. This is beautiful. This is a chapter in the transformation on nature. And this is one of the most healing. Nature's our mother. She's us, and we are her. And if you just walk into the woods or walk into a park, see what happens, and then maybe you'll feel a little bit better. Maybe you won't, but maybe you will. You got to be willing to do the experiments to see what happens. And when I say experiments, I treat everything that I'm teaching as an experiment, which means there is no fixed way it's supposed to come out. You do it and you see what happens. And then maybe you write it down again a few days later. I know for me, when I was going through the worst periods in my life, just walking in a park made a big difference. It didn't make everything go away, but it gave me some relief. And it turns out now there's plenty of scientific research showing the benefits of being in nature, improvements in various neurochemicals, the stress hormones, and improvements in mood and decreases in anxiety. So all these different, and I think one of the reasons that I work with so many different approaches is, again, because we're all different. And what may work for one person who feels unworthy may not work for another. So look, and part of what I'm doing in the transformation, and also what I do when I work with individuals or we work with large numbers of people, is we're encouraging everyone to tune into their intuition, their imagination, whatever you want, their unconscious, their greater knowing, whatever you want to call it, and start to trust. Now, you got to get somewhat into psychological and physiological balance before it's possible to do that. But then, I was just working in Sonoma County here in California. I'm in California at the moment. And we've been working with the whole county, and they've had these terrible fires a couple of years ago. And then a few weeks ago, they had a whole other bout of fires. And we've trained a couple hundred people in that county. There are clinicians, there are teachers, there are clergy, first responders, leaders of women's groups, people who work in homeless shelters, et cetera. And so we were talking, I was meeting with a bunch of those people, and they were talking about how difficult it was to once again have to deal with this kind of an existential threat, an overused adjective, but it is a threat to their lives, to their homes, to their community. And they were, some of them, quite overwhelmed. And so we did a wise guide. I led them in a wise guide imagery, had them relax, imagine they were going to a safe or comfortable place, and then imagine that a guide came to them. Could have been a person or an animal, or in my case, my guide was a tree that came to me. And then having a conversation with the part of our mind that knows, that intuitive, deep knowing that all of us have, about things that my conscious mind didn't know. And the people in the room, they did the same thing. And it was amazing, the answers they got, helping them to deal with the problems that they were having. Similar to kind of problems that you were just raising, feeling they weren't doing enough. And then getting the answer from whoever it was, the animal or the person. Yes, who do you think you are? You think you're omnipotent? Giving them the business, and the person said, "Oh, well, no, well, maybe, and beginning to sort of say, okay, well, maybe I did what I could." When somebody else was assured that she couldn't make her adult daughter do anything, so maybe she should give up on that project and just settle for loving her and letting her be. So all these different answers that people got, and other people, my tree told me, stay where you are right now. Get rooted. That's your job for this next little period of time. Okay, that sounded good. It wasn't anything I was expecting to hear.
Right.
I've done this hundreds of times. I've never had a tree as a guide before, but that's what the tree was like. I don't know if you remember the Ents in Lord of the Rings, these ancient old trees, very wise. Yeah. Put your roots down. Okay. So, you help people use these different approaches, and it's different often from kind of conventional therapeutic approaches, because you're not necessarily going head on with the problem. You're helping people develop all these different capacities and have all these different kinds of experiences that bring them back into balance and help them explore possibilities. And it's working. It's working with working with whole communities as well as working with individuals.
And so part of what you're doing is helping them to reestablish health in their nervous system, so more resilience, more balance. But then with something like that wise guide, the answers aren't coming from outside. They're coming from within. So they're being able to access their own inner knowing more.
That's right. But you need to be in some state of some balance in order to be able to get those answers from within. If you're too agitated or too shut down, makes it much harder. So it's important often to get in that state, whether by breathing deeply for a while or shaking and dancing or laughing or doing some other active expressive meditation, so that you come a little more into balance, and then the imagination has a place in which it can play. Right. Otherwise, the playing field is much too rough and it's moving all the time, and it's hard to be terribly effective in that kind of situation.
Right, right. So, one thing I'm interested in hearing about is you work with such diverse populations. Like you work with people after an earthquake, you work with people in war zones, you work with refugees, you've worked with the people from Sandy Hook after the school shooting. So, are there commonalities in the responses after similar or different types of collective traumas? What are you seeing there?
That's a very good question, and it's complex. I mean, some of the responses are similar. The world has been shaken. I mean, obvious earthquake is the most obvious example. But if you're in a school, we're doing a lot of work right now in Broward County, Florida. The shootings there were Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland. And, the whole world, which had seemed safe, no longer does.
Right.
That's a major commonality, whether it's a climate-related disaster, a school shooting, a war. Now, there are other people we work with for whom the world has never been safe. So, for example, Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, which is a Lakota reservation, tremendous amount of historical trauma. I mean, exploitation and displacement and poverty. And then after that, all the self-inflicted trauma, the alcoholism, trying to cope with the situation and the addiction and the sort of bad behavior. So that's a bit different, where people have never had any say, or kids or adults who were terribly abused as children. They never, so their world has never been safe. But in either case, what we're trying to do is establish a safe place for them, and for them to be able to share whatever they need to share, to learn the techniques like the soft belly breathing and the shaking and dancing so they can feel the safety, and then use their imagination to come up with solutions. So you mentioned refugees. One of the early experiments that we do always is we do 3 drawings, and early on, I teach them early on in the transformation. Draw yourself with your biggest problem, and draw yourself with your problem solved. So refugees, biggest problem, almost always you see a home burning or bombed. You see them, picture of them in a tent somewhere far away from home. The solution, and often they'll preface doing the drawing by saying, I don't really believe this is going to be true, or I don't know about this, but they will draw themselves with a path back home and to a new house. And, they're skeptical, understandably, but at least the image is there. The possibility has come into their minds. And many of those refugees put those drawings on the wall of their tents, because this is what they're aspiring to. This is what's giving them hope to endure the exile that they're experiencing now. So the commonality is displacement, disruption, continuous anxiety, fight or flight, irritability, remembering the past experiences, having flashbacks, having nightmares, and often feeling withdrawn from other people. Those are all common consequences, even in a place where everybody has experienced the same thing, the same earthquake or the same school shooting or the same fires. Because of the parts of our brain that shut down when we're so traumatized, we feel very alone. So those are the commonalities are really most important. Now, the specifics also have an effect. So, for example, school shootings makes you very anxious about school. That's pretty clear. It makes kids anxious about school, the teachers anxious, the parents in the community anxious about school. So it's more of a specific focus, but it permeates their whole life. And in Broward County, for example, and around the country, in many places where there were, the school shooting was 40 minutes away or 40 miles or 400 miles, kids are still anxious about school.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've seen it. And when they have these drills, these active shooter drills, it brings it all up again.
Yeah. Having
a climate-related disaster, the feeling is slightly different. It's something so overwhelming. And it becomes, the whole way of life. That's what I was seeing in Sonoma. Our whole way of life may be destroyed, is what people are feeling, because now the fires have come again. So it's a deep, sort of uneasiness about the whole world. So there are some differences, but I think the similarities are most important. And we often feel very similar things when we have an individual trauma. When, you lose someone you love, there's a breakup of a meaningful marriage or a meaningful relationship, and you feel like my world is never going to be the same. I think, in some situations, there's more self-blame. That's a situation where you're more likely to feel guilty or condemn yourself, whereas with a climate-related disaster, you won't. School shooting sort of halfway in between, because parents are saying, if only I'd done this morning, or teachers are saying, guilt is brought up for some. So there's more guilt in these individual losses, but losing someone is fully at times as devastating as having a classmate shot in school. It feels that way. It feels like our world has come to an end. We will never be the same. We'll never be able. You were talking earlier about trust. I'll never be able to be close to anybody again.
Mm.
So those personal, I think it's really important that everybody understand that just because your house wasn't blown down by a hurricane doesn't mean that trauma isn't part of your life and isn't devastating. And I think that's one of the most important messages of the transformation is that trauma comes to all of us, if not early in our life from abuse or neglect or discrimination or poverty. In midlife, it may well come with disruptions in relationships, loss of relationships, or loss of sense of ourselves and the trajectory of our lives, or parents' illnesses or deaths. And if it doesn't come then, it will surely come if we're fortunate enough to live to be old, as we get frail and deal with the loss of people we love and face our own death. So trauma is a part of life, and it's really important. And even though that may not be the most cheerful thing to say, it's also reassuring. You're not weird if you're experiencing feeling overwhelmed and discouraged after events that are distressing to you.
Hmm. Well, and the whole conversation around trauma has really changed in the last 3, 4, 5 years. Seems to be something that's being talked about a lot now. People realize
It
it's
is.
not just war, it's not just those big T traumas.
Yes, I would agree, and I think it's a very good thing. And also, it's I'm not in sort of. I don't encourage comparison of one person's trauma and another. Mine's bigger than yours. I
Right.
think it has the same downside as other comparisons. The idea is what's going on with you. And when we do groups, and we have people in groups, and some of them have lost 6 family members or 10 family members, and somebody else is struggling with an amputation, and somebody else is struggling with a relationship that is falling apart. People come to understand each other, and they come to appreciate each other because, we just give them a chance to listen to each other and to learn things to help themselves. And what happens is a much more expansive, kind of compassionate view, not only of other people, but of ourselves.
Right. Right. So, how does injustice fit in when people are just like, I can't accept that this has happened? They're to blame. And, Indigenous people come to mind too, with, colonialism and the effect of that. And how do you work with that?
Well, see, that phrase, I can't accept that this has happened. It's happened. You better accept it,
Mm.
because it has happened. And unless you accept that it's happened, how are you going to deal with it? So I think at some deep level, as horrendous as these insults and injuries have been, they did happen. And once we realize that, then we can begin to deal with it in a much more effective way. Now, what kind of justice? Aboriginal people, tribal people have many systems of justice which are far more sophisticated than any that we have.
Mhm.
Where if you've done a terrible wrong, if you've killed someone in a family, you're expected to go after whatever the conflict was. You're expected to go humbly and beg for forgiveness and make some kind of material restitution.
Mhm.
And that is often accepted. In the United States, people thrive on fighting with each other endlessly. Look at our Congress. I was
Mhm.
just in South Sudan, which is has been one of the most brutal places on the planet. 400,000 people dead just in the civil war in the last 6 years or so. A couple million people forced out of the country, a couple million more displaced internally. But I went, and with a colleague of mine, a Sudanese human rights lawyer, Ania Taoul, and we did a workshop for 80 people, including people from the rival political parties who are still killing each other in the countryside, who are trying to come together to create a government, a new government. And they were there, representatives were there, representatives from the women's groups, from the army, from the major non-government organizations, religious organizations. And they wanted to see if it was possible to get beyond their hatred and their injuries, because they recognized if they didn't do it, they were never going to be able to form a just government or bring peace. So they were able, and it was very dramatic, but at some point, they were able to share their feelings, including their fury and fear and everything else with each other. And then I got them up shaking and dancing, and we did some, they were open to it. Now, can I do this with the US Congress? Are you kidding? They're not interested. They want to stay where they are.
Right.
I mean, I have offered and will offer again. But, you know, we need to be willing to enter a process and see what is possible. Not because, you know, it's not even necessarily about, initially, it's not about forgiveness. It's just about openness to seeing, to really working for what's important. And I think people have to decide what's important to you. If all that, and this is certainly something, people should be in general punished for what they've done wrong. Mm-hmm. But okay, what then? And is that the be all and end all? Well, some societies say, no, we're not really, you know, that's not primarily what we're interested in. We want people to move and become peaceful. We want them not to do it again. Our primary concern is restitution, but not punishment.
Right.
So we have to look at ourselves. What do we want? I mean, does that mean you should love the person who assaulted you or raped you? Or no, I'm not suggesting that. Yeah. But I'll tell you one story. We were in Kosovo after the war, and we were doing a training program, and there was a teacher in the training program. And toward the end of a 5-day training, we do a forgiveness meditation. And you know, sometimes people can forgive, sometimes they can't. It's a but after 4 or 5 days of a training, it becomes more possible. So this man said, after he did the forgiveness meditation, forgiving somebody who'd hurt him, asking for forgiveness from somebody he had hurt, and then forgiving himself using guided imagery. I teach this technique in the transformation. It's not original with me. I learned it from my friend Joan Halifax years ago. But it's very effective, very simple. Afterwards, he got up and he said, well, I'm not going to forgive the man, the Serbian paramilitary who killed my brother. On the other hand, I don't want to spend the rest of my life seeking revenge. And he laughed, and he said, I said, great. That's beautiful. So, and if people are interested, this is another thing. They can look at CBS 60 Minutes did a segment that featured our work with war traumatized kids in Gaza and Israel. And one of the kids who's briefly mentioned in the segment, after the war, the 2014 war, is in Gaza. He drew himself, the solution to his biggest problem was to put on a suicide belt and kill Israelis. That's the first group, right? Before he started our program. After 9 groups, he drew a picture. They don't show this in the 60 Minutes segment, which is why I'm mentioning. They show a picture of him, and he's in a car. And I said to him, he's 9 years old, I said to him, what's this? He said, I am the driver for the first president of Palestine. Oh. So here's the shift. Here's the shift from wanting to kill and perpetuate the war and get back at the people who killed his father. Understandable.
Yeah.
But on his own, without nobody's telling him to be a nice boy and be peaceful, he's discovering, he's accessing his own incredible wisdom and seeing himself as a productive member of a future state. That's really what he wants.
Right, right.
So I think we have to look at what's really important to us, and we have to open ourselves to whatever the possibilities are, and they may be far broader than we think at first.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's really inspiring.
And one of the things, I mean, there are examples. Again, you think of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. Desmond Tutu's a friend. He's on my advisory board. And, you know, he led that commission, and people were able, many of them, not everybody, to move into a whole other place. South Africa obviously still has major problems,
Right.
but at least they were able to begin to heal some of those wounds. And we need to learn from other people.
Right. Right. So what's your kind of final bit of what you'd like people to know who are feeling inspired or feeling like, well, maybe, what would you like them to know?
I have to say, the first thing that comes to my mind is that Bob Dylan quote: "Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters." What I want to say to people is start tuning in to what's really going on inside you. Give yourself a chance to come back into balance and start using tools and techniques that help you access and learn from that great wisdom that is there in every one of you. That's why I wrote The Transformation. That's what my work is all about. And as you do that, consider the possibility of maybe connecting with other people who are on this same kind of journey and learning from and supporting each other. So that's what I would wish for everyone who's watching or listening to us.
Mm-hmm. So your website address, where can people get more from you?
It's CMBM.org, Center for Mind Body Medicine.org. People can read about the programs we're doing. They can join an online group or an in-person group, or if they want to come and use this method to help other people, they can come to one of our training programs, CMBM.org. Mm-hmm. They should read The Transformation. That's the basic book of all this work. The Transformation, Discovering Wholeness and Healing After Trauma. All the information is in there. They can look at me on James Gordon, MD, Twitter, Instagram, and see what I'm up to and be in touch with me that way as well. So, and you can buy the book. You can buy the book online or buy it in your independent bookstore.
Right. And the book is it's readable, it's practical, it's an excellent book. I think it's the best book I've read on trauma. So
thank you very much. I really appreciate that, Lynn.
Yeah.
I know you've read a number, so.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and thank you for being on the summit with us and for sharing your wisdom. And thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you. And maybe, hopefully, we'll talk again in some form or other. So thank you. I've enjoyed this thoroughly. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Hello, this is Lynn Fraser with the Kiloby Center Radical Recovery Summit. We are so excited to bring you the lineup for January 10th to 19th, 2020. Go to radicalrecoverysummit.com to see the new headliners for 2020 and to sign up. You can watch free January 10th to 19th or buy an all-access pass.